In this Tuesday morning in Delaware, where jury deliberations will continue today in the Hunter Biden federal criminal gun trial.
The jury met behind closed doors for about an hour yesterday before court was adjourned for the day. Before that, both sides delivered their closing arguments. Hunter Biden's defense team rested its case without sending him to the witness stand. Hunter Biden is the first child of a sitting president to face a criminal trial. Those charges tied to the purchase of a gun back in 2018. He has pleaded not guilty. Leading us off this morning, we're joined by NBC's Mike Memoli outside the courthouse in Wilmington. Also joined in studio by NBC News legal analyst Danny Savalos. Good morning to both of you. Mike, let's start with you. This case progressing quickly. Catch us up on closing arguments. How did both sides make their cases to the jury?
Well, Joe, the prosecutors really relied on what they called the overwhelming evidence that they were able to introduce over the course of 4 days of testimony that they said showed Hunter Biden was a habitual user of illegal drugs at the time of the purchase. They said that evidence, which included text messages, photos, witness testimony, and even Hunter Biden's own words, showed that it was overwhelming, it was ugly, it was personal, but they said this evidence was absolutely necessary. At one point, one of the prosecutors saying, if this evidence doesn't show that Hunter Biden was an addict, then nobody is an addict. Now, defense attorney Abbe Lowell, he invoked what he called the accordion defense. He said that the prosecution may have stretched out over a long period of time, 4 years, evidence that some of which they don't dispute that Hunter Biden was using illegal drugs, but they said you have to shrink it down just to that narrow window of time before, during, and after he purchased the gun. They said if they had specific evidence that showed him using drugs around that time, they did not introduce it. They only had suggestive evidence. Now, Joe, there was one tense moment during this closing arguments when the prosecutors invoked the First Lady, who, of course, has been seated behind her son for most of the trial. The prosecutor pointing behind him to say, this is not evidence. Now, Abbe Lowell said, clearly took issue with that, thinking that it was a personal invocation that was not merited at this point, Joe.
Danny, let's bring you in here and talk about what the prosecution did use to sort of try to make their case here. Hunter Biden's own words in his memoir, lots of text messages. What do you make of the job that they've done here? Did they meet that burden of proof?
This case is unusual because it has as one of its elements for the prosecution to prove defendant's addiction, which is normally not an element of a crime. But you also have a defendant here who, unlike a run-of-the-mill defendant, just somebody you've never heard of, this is a defendant who's written a book about his addiction, thereby making it somewhat easier for the government to meet its burden of proof. They also have the assistance of all these text messages and other communications and witnesses who saw him. So they tied all that together. And like a typical government case, there is a ton of evidence here from which the jury can infer addiction at the time of the firearm purchase. Whether they will is another question.
So let's talk about Hunter Biden's defense. Then Abbe Lowell arguing that the prosecution offered only, quote, speculation or conjecture, not hard evidence that he was using drugs at the time. What do you make of his defense?
That's a real tough one to argue because you're basically saying to the jury, look at all this evidence of crack cocaine use. They even the government used a demonstrative exhibit, like a calendar, color-coded to show all the evidence of addiction during a particular period of time. And Abbe Lowell's basically saying, yeah, they have all that evidence, but did they show on these exact days that he was an addict? And there may be some jurors thinking, yeah, that's enough evidence for us. So it's a really tough argument. Remember, the government gets to cherry pick its favorite cases and facts to bring. The defense never gets to pick the facts. A lot of times the argument is a stretch, but sometimes it's your only argument.
Mike, what are the next steps once the jury has reached a verdict? And if he is found guilty, how long would it be until we get a sentence?
Well, remember, there are 3 different counts here, 2 related to whether Hunter Biden lied on that government form, 1 simply owning the gun while he was addicted itself. They carry a maximum jail time of 10 years. So if the president's son is indeed convicted, we could see him, it's very unlikely, but brought into custody immediately. It's much more likely that there will be a period of months while the judge considers that sentence. Now, of course, if he is acquitted, then he walks out of this courtroom a free man. Now, we should note the First Lady we expect to be present here yet again. The president is in Washington, and believe it or not, he's expected to hold an event today on, of all issues, gun safety.
All right, Mike and Danny, thank you both. Appreciate it.
Well, turning out of the war in the Middle East, where the United Nations Security Council has passed a U.S.-drafted ceasefire deal aimed at ending the 8-month-long war in Gaza.
On top of that, the U.S. is strongly considering negotiations with Hamas to reach a unilateral deal that would release the 5 American hostages being held in Gaza. U.S. officials say these negotiations would not include Israel. NBC News international correspondent Raf Sanchez has more on the potential negotiations.
Hey there, the U.S. effort to end the war in Gaza appears to be gaining momentum after the UN Security Council last night voted to support the ceasefire and hostage release plan laid out by President Biden. Now, that plan will only become a reality if Israel and Hamas can reach a deal. The U.S. says Israel has already accepted that proposal and that Hamas is the only remaining holdout. Now, we are learning more today about that Israeli commando raid that brought those 4 hostages home from central Gaza. Head camera footage from one of those police commandos shows the unit bursting through the door of an apartment and finding those 3 terrified male hostages being held in a back room. They called them out by name, and then they escorted them under fire through a grove to waiting vehicles. Noah Argamani, the 4th hostage, was found in another apartment nearby. The IDF says these were family apartments, but that the hostages were being held by armed guards. Now, Israel, over the course of this 8-month war, has rescued 7 hostages alive. There are still 120, both living and dead, inside of Gaza, and the U.S. is saying the best way to bring them all home and to end the suffering in Gaza is through that ceasefire plan laid out by President Biden. But U.S. officials tell NBC News the administration has discussed a plan B if those ceasefire talks fail, where the U.S. would consider making a unilateral deal with Hamas to bring the 8 American hostages home. The parents of Hirsch Goldberg, Poland, one of those hostages, saying they would welcome any effort to bring their son home. But any deal is going to come too late for those roughly 270 people that the health ministry says were killed by Israeli fire during that hostage rescue over the weekend. That number includes 60 children. Secretary Blinken is here in Israel, but heading on to Jordan and then on to Qatar to meet with mediators there. Back to you.
All right, Raf, thank you.
Let's now bring in Gershon Baskin. He's the Middle East director of the International Communities Organization and has worked on Israeli and Palestinian hostage negotiations. Thank you very much, as always, for joining us. So just yesterday, the UN Security Council voted in support of the ceasefire proposal drafted by the U.S. Do you think this is the kind of plan presented in an international body that can potentially actually end the fighting here? Do you think at this point both sides are going to see that it's in their interest to agree?
It's a great resolution, and the United States did a very good job on it, as did President Biden in his speech when he laid out the plan. The basic bottom line problem is that both from the words of President Biden and the UN Security Council resolution, it is clear that adoption of the plan leads to the end of the war. For Hamas, there is no deal with Israel that doesn't lead to the end of the war. And for Israel at the present time, under Netanyahu and his government, there is no deal that they will agree to that does lead to an end to the war. So it seems to me that the gaps are still unbridgeable unless someone comes up with a magic formula. The Israeli government is now even more hard line in its approach after Mr. Gantz and his party left. And Netanyahu is hostage to his right-wing government, who said, no deal, no end to the war. The hostages only come second after we have our ultimate total victory over Hamas.
Let's talk about this major headline this week. The U.S. is considering negotiations with Hamas to reach a unilateral deal that would free 5 American hostages in Gaza. These discussions would not include Israel. 2 questions here. What does the U.S. need to prioritize to strike a successful deal with Hamas? And what does this say about the state of the relationship between the U.S. and Israel?
Right. First of all, I believe that there are 8 American citizens in Gaza. 5 of them are believed to be alive. I was asked by someone about 2 weeks ago to inquire with some Hamas leaders if a possible deal with the United States could be made. I didn't get an answer. The basic question that I asked them was, what would you demand from the United States in exchange for these hostages? And quite frankly, there's very little that the United States has to offer that can offer Hamas that they are interested in. They don't control the war. They don't control anything that Hamas is interested in, except perhaps stopping shipment of arms to Israel. And I don't imagine that the United States is going to do that. So it seems very unlikely that there's even a possibility of such a deal.
Let's talk about Israel's recent rescue operation that we've covered quite a bit here. 4 hostages reunited with their families. Many people have called that a light in the darkness. Others point out that it came at the expense of hundreds of civilian lives inside Gaza. How do you think that particular operation could impact any future hostage deals?
Well, I think it's clear that Hamas is probably moving hostages around from locations that they might be vulnerable and found through Israeli and American intelligence to places where they are more likely underground and in tunnels. Hamas has said immediately after that rescue operation that that it puts the lives of the hostages in danger, and I take Hamas seriously. I would not want to be a hostage under any circumstances, and particularly under those circumstances. There are serious questions about the Israeli rescue operation, both legal and ethical. Of course, from a legal point of view, holding civilian hostages is in contravention of international law. Keeping them in civilian homes turns those civilian homes into military targets. But there is also the ethical question of how many people is legitimate to kill in order to save hostages. International law talks about proportionality, but we don't really know what that means. How many is it proportional to kill in exchange for 4 living Israeli hostages?
Gershon Baskin, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Exactly 1 month from today, former President Donald Trump faces sentencing for his conviction in the New York hush money case. According to sources familiar with the matter, former President Trump met with a probation officer on Monday as part of a mandatory pre-sentencing process. Last month, he was found guilty on all 34 counts of falsifying business records. Mr. Trump answered questions with his probation officer virtually from his home in Mar-a-Lago, with his lawyer Todd Blanche present. The meeting was described as short, lasting less than 30 minutes. He now faces up to 4 years in prison or, given his lack of a criminal record, potentially simply probation. Voters are heading to the polls today as primaries get underway in 4 states.
Yeah, today, Maine, Nevada, North Dakota, and South Carolina will get their turn. There's a congressional seat also up for grabs in Ohio. A special election is being held there to fill the remainder of former Congressman Bill Johnson's term. Johnson resigned from Congress in January to become president of Youngstown State University.
NBC News senior political editor Mark Murray joins us with more on what to expect. Mark, good to have you with us. Several contests we're keeping an eye on starting in South Carolina. Congresswoman Nancy Mace is looking to win a 3rd term on Capitol Hill. Now, she's butted heads in the past with former President Trump, as well as former House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. What are some of the challenges that she's facing today?
Yeah, Joe, you're exactly right. Nancy Mace ended up being opposed by Donald Trump in the 2022 midterms. And she actually was one of the very few members of the Republican delegation who ended up surviving a Trump primary challenge. This time, she actually has Donald Trump's support. And this time, she's being opposed by some of Kevin McCarthy and his allies after Nancy Mace ended up voting to oust Kevin McCarthy from his speakership.
Also in South Carolina, Congressman William Timmons is being challenged in the GOP primary by State Representative Adam Morgan. He's the chair of the South Carolina Freedom Caucus. What should we know about this race?
Yeah, Savannah, this time you end up having the situation where Timmons is being challenged from his right. Morgan has the backing of Matt Gaetz, the firebrand House Republican from Florida. And you end up having Morgan saying and opposing Timmons for supporting McCarthy during that speakership fight. And so this time you end up having somebody who is actually coming from the right. And all indications are that this is a very close race.
Hovering above all these races is the Trump factor, so we know the power of his endorsements will be put to the test. Several candidates he's backed are facing hotly contested primary battles. What more can you tell us about some of these races?
So Donald Trump has endorsed Nancy Mace in the South Carolina primary we already talked about. He has also endorsed Timmons in that race we were talking about earlier. Then you end up having Trump endorsing Kelly Armstrong in the race for North Dakota governor. What's interesting, Doug Burgum, the current North Dakota governor who's not seeking re-election, has endorsed his lieutenant governor. And of course, Burgum is in some people believe on the short list to be Donald Trump's possible running mate. Donald Trump also has endorsed Sam Brown in the Nevada Senate contest. And so we're going to be watching these Trump endorsements up and down the ballot and across the country in tonight's primaries, seeing who won and who lost.
All right. Mark, as always, thank you so much.
Thanks, Mark. Well, we are learning more about a controversial video showing Burbank police dropping off a homeless man in Los Angeles, then driving off as the man collapses on the sidewalk. The incident is sparking backlash as LA city leaders continue to battle an ongoing homeless crisis. NBC News correspondent Morgan Chesky has more.
It's the video igniting a blame game between Los Angeles and a neighboring city over the alleged dumping of a homeless man outside their jurisdiction. Two Burbank police officers seen on a North Hollywood street in L.A., taking a man out of their cruiser and removing his handcuffs. Moments later, he falls to his knees, appearing unable to walk. Once the Burbank cruiser pulls away, the man collapses onto the sidewalk. Los Angeles City Council President Paul Krikorian, whose office surveillance camera captured the ordeal, says multiple agencies are now investigating.
This is callous, cruel, inhumane.
Burbank police say they were responding to a call of a naked man at a bus stop. The department says he'd been taken to a Burbank hospital from an L.A. neighborhood. After declining medical help, police say they offered him a ride, adding he voluntarily got into the patrol vehicle and was driven towards L.A.'s metro station before he asked to get out for a coffee, and officers complied. The controversy comes amid the backdrop of a historic homeless crisis in L.A., with 46,000 people without housing.
We've known for a long time that other cities, other jurisdictions prefer to just push people into Los Angeles rather than addressing the problem themselves.
Burbank police tell NBC News the department is conducting their own investigation, reviewing both body and in-car camera footage, all of it centered around the actions of those two officers.
All right, Morgan Chesky, thank you.
Let's get a check on your morning news now. Weather. The Sunshine State will see a whole lot of rain this week.
Yeah, Angie Lastman is with us. She's watching the flood risk in Florida. Angie, good morning.
Good morning, guys. Sunshine State not living up to its name this week. We're going to see multiple days of some really heavy rain, and it's already started across portions of the state. Mainly the southern half of the state is where we're specifically going to be watching for the most impactful weather over the next couple of days. Right now, flood watches are up for 6 million people. It does include West Palm Beach, Miami, Marco Island, as far south as Key West, too. And those will likely stay with us for at least the rest of our work week. And here's why. Let's take a look at the setup. We've got this kind of stalled front that's going to hang out right about northern Florida to central Florida over the next couple of days. And we have plenty of moisture to tap into from the Caribbean. We've got a high pressure sitting just offshore of the Bahamas, and that's going to kind of usher in all of that moisture for repeated rounds as the front sits there and kind of brings all of that unsettled weather right to the same areas over and over the next couple of days. So here's how it plays out. There's the front I was mentioning, and here's all the rain we're expecting today. It's going to be rounds of some really heavy rain. The rainfall rates will be quite impressive at times, and it's not just today. As I mentioned, it goes through tomorrow, too. That stalled front continuing to produce more rain. A lot of it is the southern tier of the state, but still it's going to go as far north as parts of central Florida as well, and it lasts into Thursday and even Friday. Now, the one note about this is that it is going to be beneficial in a lot of ways. If you take a look at the drought monitor for the state, we do have plenty of folks in the severe range of the drought, but more than 40% of the state is at least in a moderate drought. So they could use some rain. It is getting to rainy season for folks there, so the rain will be beneficial to a point. But when we're talking upwards of a foot of rain in some spots, especially in a short amount of time, in a state that has a lot of difficulties with dealing with flooding concerns anyway, we're likely going to see that be on tap for folks there, especially Southwest Florida. That's where we're looking to see potentially more than a foot of rain, up to 15 inches. And again, this is going to go through Friday, so we'll see how this develops, but the flooding concern will be something that we closely watch. Again, it looks most concerning from Tampa down down to Miami, including parts of the Keys as well. We're going to see these slow-moving storms. It's going to be really pesky for folks that are going to be out and about, so we'll be keeping a close eye on that, at least through the end of the work week. Now, big picture look of the rest of the country today. We'll, of course, be watching that flooding, but we'll also see the potential for some strong storms centered across parts of the South. We'll see that for Texas, Oklahoma. Folks there will deal with a little bit of rain. Otherwise, a great day across much of the East. Maybe a couple of kind of showers, pesky showers, but nothing too impressive for folks in the mid-Atlantic. Temperature-wise, though, great conditions for the Northeast. We'll sit into those upper 70s today in a lot of places like New York City. Out west, though, a different story. We're once again dealing with the really uncomfortable heat. Temperatures will be into the triple digits once again. And that heat, unfortunately, guys, if you're keeping track of the comfortable temperatures across the East, those are not here to stay. As we get through the next couple of days, actually, that heat will start to spread a little farther to the east, and we'll be talking temperatures 10, 15 degrees above normal. Even places like New York City could hit the 90s by the time the week ends.
Yeah, I was looking ahead to next week. I was just taking a little sneak peek into next week, and I was like, yeah, it's looking
You like
hot.
what you see or no?
No.
Yeah, me neither.
Thanks, Angie.
Of course.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.